Chapter 7. A well-known poet, not Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote The Wreck of Hesperus, a poem with which the incorrigible children were already quite familiar, but a different poet, named Robert Burns, once wrote a poem called simply To a Mouse. Now, you might find this title silly and even a bit misleading, for what famous poet writes poems to mice? Especially if there are so many shipwrecks, headless horsemen, gloomy talking birds, and other equally fascinating topics to write poems about. On the other hand, perhaps Mr. Burns was using his poetic license. This is the license that allows poets to say things that are not precisely true, without being accused of telling lies. Anyone may obtain such a license, but still, the powers it grants must be wielded responsibly. A word to the wise. When asked, "Who put the empty milk carton back in the refrigerator?" If you reply, "My incorrigible sister Lavinia," when in fact it was you who was the guilty party, at the ensuing trial, the judge will not be impressed to hear you defend yourself by claiming that your whopper was merely poetic license. However, the title To a Mouse is not an example of poetic license, for the poem was, in fact, written to a mouse, which simply goes to prove that one never knows from what furry little rodent inspiration will strike. In Mr. Burns's case, inspiration struck the poet soon after his plow struck the nest of a wee beastie, which is to say, a small field mouse, and tore it all to pieces. His 8-stanza apology includes this memorable line: "The best laid schemes of mice and men gang aft a gilly." It should be pointed out that the poem is written in an old Scottish dialect, and thus contains words that are rarely used nowadays, even in Scotland. To gang aft a agly means to often go astray. What Mr. Burns was driving at was this. The mouse, who had built herself a cozy nest and was no doubt feeling quite smug about it, was now flat out of luck, for that it is simply the way life goes, not only for mice, but people too. One thing is planned, and yet something quite different actually occurs. A careless poet accidentally plows your mouse house to bits. An important appointment is missed due to a flat tire on one's bicycle, or a well-intended and perfectly friendly overture is interpreted as something else entirely. Thus it was the next day when Penelope eventually went downstairs to strike up a conversation with Lady Constance. Her impulse to offer some fellowship was a kind and noble one, and yet it was received in an entirely different spirit. For one of the disadvantages of having a postal delivery 5 times a day is that it creates so many opportunities to be disappointed when a much-longed-for invitation fails, and fails, and fails yet again to arrive. The morning post had brought nothing to the house but the day's newspaper. The midday post had brought an advertisement promoting the skills of a local chimney sweep. Now it was nearly 3 o'clock, and another post was due any moment. It was Margaret's duty to await the postman by the front door, silver letter tray in hand. As was always the case at mail time, there were 2 sharp raps on the knocker, after which the mail came sliding through a brass mail slot in the lower part of the heavy wooden door. "Is it the post?" Lady Constance's voice rang eagerly down the stairs. "Yes, my lady, but—" "The post, the post!" Lady Constance clattered down 2 flights at a dangerous pace. She ran so fast her hair came undone and popped up in yellow curlicues all around her head. "The afternoon post at last, for this morning I sent word to all my acquaintances in town, saying I had arrived. I expect to be buried in luncheon invitations, and dinner invitations too, of course, and asked on all manner of excursions. Margaret, remind me to tell Miss Clark we ought to offer a small gratuity to the postman. His mail-bag is bound to be extra heavy for the duration of our stay in London." But there was nothing on Margaret's tray except a brochure for Dr. Phelps's Miracle Cream, guaranteed to remove wrinkles, spots, warts, and lumps. This drama would be played out again at 5 o'clock and finally at 8. By that point, Lady Constance was in a foul mood. The lack of correspondence seemed to be taking a dreadful toll on her already delicate constitution. She refused her supper, and instead demanded a particular type of marzipan that Miss Clark had to send the young houseboy Jasper scurrying all over London to find. Then she very nearly scalded herself in the newfangled bathtub, and had to be lifted out red-faced and yelling by 2 terrified maids. Lord Frederick had scarcely been home at all. "Business, dear," he'd explained as he rushed out the door right after breakfast. In short, Lady Constance was on her very last nerve, and the final post of the day was due in exactly 1½ minutes. Alas, it was at that very moment, after the Incorrigibles had been tucked into their beds, that Penelope came downstairs. The intention to show a bit of warmth to her mistress was still firmly lodged in her mind. She knew nothing about Lady Constance's postal disappointments, since she herself had been happily occupied all day, strolling the parks of London while studying latitude and longitude with the children. This was Alexander's request. He was quite taken with the topic of navigation all of a sudden, and refused to go 10 steps in any direction without referring to his compass. And the children showed admirable restraint when it came to both squirrels and pigeons. Penelope had only had to offer a few cautionary reminders and the occasional distracting biscuit. Yes, Penelope was in quite a different mood than poor Lady Constance. For the very notion of navigation made her think of Simon, and the thought of Simon made her giddy. Giddy enough to be idly whistling the same lilting sea shanty that Simon himself was prone to whistling while taking a reading on his sextant, as she skipped lightly down the stairs. And Penelope, too, was half expecting a letter, for she had written to Simon in that morning's post, inquiring about the old woman. Might a reply be on the way already? Clearly, in London, anything was possible. "Good evening, Lady Constance," she called out cheerfully when she spotted the lady standing next to Margaret at the front door. "Welcome to Muffinshire Lane. Isn't London marvellous?" Lady Constance turned, and Penelope saw that her usually perfectly dressed mistress was, to be kind, a wreck. Her cheeks were scalded, her hair was frizzed, and her eyes were puffy and ringed round with dark, exhausted circles, like those of a raccoon. "I fail to see what is so marvellous, Miss Lumley," she snapped. Then she spun back to Margaret and began desperately wringing her hands. "This is the last post of the day, is it not?" "Yes, my lady, but—" "Why is it so late?" Margaret swallowed anxiously. "It hasn't yet struck 8 o'clock, my lady. I'm sure he will be here soon." There were the 2 raps on the door. Penelope watched, puzzled, as Lady Constance gasped and clutched her throat. Margaret stood in readiness as a single, elegant envelope poked through the slot and dropped noiselessly on the tray. "Finally!" Lady Constance shrieked. "Is that it? There is only the one?" "Yes, my lady, but—" "Let me have it, please." "Yes, my lady, but—" Terror had reduced Margaret to a single phrase, yet no matter how many times she uttered it, Lady Constance paid her no mind. "Let me have it now, or I will take it myself." Lady Constance hurled herself forward to snatch the letter. "But it's for Miss Lumley, my lady," Margaret squeaked. She curtsied low and extended the tray to Penelope. The grim silence as Penelope gingerly descended the bottom step, walked 5 paces forward, and took the lovely cream-colored envelope from Margaret's tray, was broken only by the cooing of a grandfather clock in the hall, striking the hour. That meant Lady Constance had 8 full cuckoos to build up a head of steam. She used the time well, and when the 8th was done, she let loose. "Miss Lumley, do my eyes deceive me? This is the most impertinent thing I have ever heard of." "Perhaps it's from the same gentleman who wrote to you yesterday," Margaret squeaked in a confidential tone. Alas, it was not confidential enough. Lady Constance took a menacing step towards Penelope. "Yesterday? Do you mean to tell me that you, a mere governess, have received 2 separate pieces of correspondence since arriving in London, while I have received none whatsoever?" "I do apologize, Lady Constance." Penelope keenly wanted to glance at the envelope to see if it was in fact from Simon, but she dared not in fear of Lady Constance, who looked as if she might tear it to shreds with her teeth. "It was not my intention to receive any letters. They simply arrived." And then, perhaps unwisely, she added, "Do you know that poem by Mr. Robert Burns called 'To a Mouse'? I was just reading it to the children before bedtime. It makes rather the same point, about things not happening in the way we expect. The best laid plans of mice and men." But much as she would have liked to, Penelope did not get to pronounce "gang aft agley," because Lady Constance was not listening. "Hm!" Lady Constance said, speechless with fury, and then again, "Hm!" Then she stormed back upstairs to her lavishly decorated, but friendless suite of rooms, leaving Penelope and Margaret staring at their shoes, at least until Lady Constance was well out of sight. Then, without risking any animated conversation, exclamations of delight, or other audible signs of happiness that might provoke their mistress further, Margaret simply handed Penelope the silver letter opener, which had been lying unused all day on the tray. Her expression of intense, agonizing curiosity said the rest, as did the excited way she pranced in place and the soundless giggle that she carefully muffled with her free hand. But the letter was not from Simon at all. It was a reply from Miss Charlotte Mortimer. Once she realized that, Penelope was even happier than she'd been before, though it was a different sort of happy. Happy, that is, until she read the letter. My dear Penny, I am so relieved to hear that you and the children made it to London without incident. Did the Hicksby guide lead the way? Please join me for luncheon tomorrow in the Fern Court at the Piazza Hotel. Though I long to meet your 3 pupils, and plan to do so at the earliest safe opportunity, for now it is best we talk alone. I have news, and not all of it good, and none of it for children's ears. I ask that you shall keep the time and place of our meeting to yourself. I shall be there at 12 sharp. Look for me by the Asmondia Regalis. Do be careful. Yours, as ever, Miss Charlotte Mortimer.